I'd like to introduce our first speaker this morning. Our first speaker is Ryan Lance. Ryan is an attorney and counsel to the Sweetwater River Conservancy. Ryan served as the director of the Wyoming State Lands and Investments for Wyoming Governor Matthew Mead and state planning coordinator, deputy chief of staff, policy advisor, and Endangered Species Act coordinator in the administration of Governor Dave Freudenthal. Ryan was a central figure in the development of the core area strategy to manage greater sage-grouse populations in Wyoming, and has worked on numerous land and species conservation projects while guiding oil and gas, coal, uranium, and renewable development through federal, state, and permitting requirements. I think most everybody in the room has dealt with Ryan. He's been he's worked in so many different areas that I'm really looking forward to his discussion this morning. And we asked him, we challenged him with the difficult discussion on anticipation of policy needs for state, federal, energy-related projects. Would you welcome Ryan Lance, please?
I've been watching, I'm sure like you all have, the recent town halls that a lot of the Republican members of Congress have been facing when they've gone home. And I've really kind of gotten keyed in on this notion of these flip cards where people could say agree or disagree. And after Dave's presentation yesterday, I was really thinking that would have been nice for him to see your disagreement like out in the front. But I don't want those cards for my presentation, not necessarily. The nice thing is I used to work for Dave, so there isn't absolute agreement on the points that he raised. I'm going to double down a little bit on this notion of decision-relevant science and put it into context as to how it was used in the past, how it was a consideration in the previous policy decisions and scientific funding decisions that were made, at least during my time in government, and then offer some challenges to you all in terms of some maybe incendiary policy statements, and maybe get to some of the questions that the commissioners and the policy folks need to know from you all to inform policy going forward, because ultimately science has a component part in that policy, but it isn't their only consideration. So making it relevant to them, bringing the cookies from the top shelf down to the bottom for people like me is really, really important. So I want to start with some of the premises that Dave outlined yesterday and that a lot of the topics really touched on. So I think in order to understand what all the hullabaloo is about today, you have to go back and put it in context. So in 1917, when the Convention for Migratory Birds was being negotiated, this was our reality. We had women with huge feather hats that were demanding more and more feather hats because that was all the rage. And we had these pictures, which I'm sure all of us have from our grandparents and our great-grandparents, where there are lines and lines of ducks and geese lined up outside on the fence post or hanging off of the front porch. And there was really no construct for wildlife conservation or management. Remember, this is the time when all the game and fish departments were starting up because Wyoming didn't have any antelope left. We had a host of issues we were facing. Migration was not a thing. That was, we'll shoot them here and let God sort it out later. And still today, there's some of that in South America and elsewhere. But and frankly here, in certain circumstances. Now, I love Gary Bouvet because every time he talks, I get to steal something from him. And I'm going to take the unnamed X and Y axis data information line next. But this is from Gary, and this also puts it in context. This is a journal article from 1918, William Hornaday, and it talks about a demand from civilization to the western states. Think about that. We were not civilization to the east. They were civilization. We were a bunch of thugs, And we were proving it in court. We were suing on any regulation that was going through at the time, and we were challenging it on states' rights clauses. We were challenging it on anything we could to beat it down. And, this is contextually interesting because in 1918, they were concerned about sage grouse going extinct even then. And today we still talk about that, which is not lost on me. But, so the context then shifts to today. So in 1917, you had the states fighting any regulation that was out there. You had the states asserting all sorts of primacy and jurisdiction because of the muddied waters of federal policy. You had this convention between the United States and Great Britain and other countries being negotiated, and we had to protect migratory birds because women had to have feathers in their hats and because we were indiscriminately killing birds. So put that in the context of today. Today, it's very small, but those issues have largely been resolved, not the least of which through the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is at the very bottom of that list. But it's in the matrix of a much broader set of policies that exist today that I believe has fundamentally shifted the need for a strict liability regime under the MBTA, and I believe it has fundamentally shifted how we should look at planning for these sorts of species. You now have the Endangered Species Act, you have the Clean Water Act, you have the Clean Air Act, you have NEPA, you have the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, FLTMA. You have state non-game programs. Remember, we were suing in 1917 to say no. Today, we sue to say yes. We try to find ways to build our state wildlife action plans to get federal dollars into our state to conserve these populations we used to want to obliterate. And so our circumstance is much different today. But I would even argue back in 1917, the way Congress enacted what we agreed to in the convention isn't the proper way they should have done it. Because if you read it, Article 7 of that convention says permits to kill any of the above named birds, which were all the migratory birds and all the other stuff, under extraordinary circumstances, mind you, may become seriously injurious to agricultural or other interests. They knew then that there were economic considerations that may be brought to bear that would require incidental take authorization. That wasn't carried forward into the law in 1918. That's the convention we signed, but we doubled down on a much higher standard. So what? So we have all this stuff, we have all that stuff. We didn't have it in 1917, we have it today. What does it mean? I would argue with all of that, with the ESA, with FLTMA, with the NEPA analysis that is done, we have a desperate need to crosswalk a lot of that logic that we have gained through the years since 1917 and abandon the Migratory Bird Treaty Act strict liability standard that we have in the 10th Circuit and a lot of other circuits in the country. And I would argue that because we've learned through the ESA for threatened species anyway, for species listed because they are imperiled. We've done analysis to say ESA species are in such trouble, we're going to put them on this list and we're going to put them on a shelf, but we're still going to allow regulatory take, even for those species. But we don't do that for MBTA. We make a passing argument that we can. We veil it in all of these sort of proffers to industry that if you do it, or if you do an avian protection plan, we may exercise our discretion differently. But at the end of the day, when the gavel falls in the 10th Circuit, no matter what you say about risk deniability, about the ability to limit risk, it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. Because that court is going to apply a strict liability standard and say, no. But what happens before that? Dave talked about it yesterday. There's this prosecutorial discretion that gets applied. But that's only if you come in on your hands and your knees and you talk very nicely to the right people. But if you irritate the wrong person, that discretion gets applied differently. There is no standardization. There is nothing but discretion in the system, and that's why it is flawed. Now, I'm not saying ESA it doesn't have that. I'm not saying NEPA doesn't have that. We all know decisions are made by individuals. But there is not the back-end hammer that they know they're going to get a prosecution and a conviction that they do have with the MBTA. For ESA, if you have a take authorization from the Fish and Wildlife Service, you can go in. It's a get-out-of-jail card in functional terms. You've got that take authorization. With the MBTA, you've done an avian protection plan, you've done everything you're going to do. You can go into the U.S. Attorney's Office and they can say, sorry, that was all well and good, but MBTA is a strict liability statute. No. I argue we need to take the logic that we have learned through ESA and through the other regulatory take authorizations that are in other statutes and apply it in the context of the MBTA species. I also think we need to focus on habitat. Dave skirted the issue yesterday because he said, well, the MBTA doesn't allow the consideration. That's not really true. I mean, we talked about that. Nests. I mean, if you read the convention from 1917, it talks very broadly about nests and the importance of nests and that habitat function, but it wasn't carried over, not in a direct term like it is in the Endangered Species Act. But as we've learned in the intervening umpteen years since 1917, the scientific knowledge at the time in 1917 has advanced. We're now talking about landscapes. We're talking about connectivity. We're talking about all of these things that were sort of inklings, but not really areas of focus. And I think that could serve us well. I think it could do a heck of a lot more for the species. I think under the ESA, I think under MBTA, any of the wildlife laws, we've got to get real. And real means we've got to start prioritizing. We're already doing it. If you read the MBTA website from the Fish and Wildlife Service, they have gradations of species. Certain species are high priority, doesn't matter, not in the 10th Circuit, because any of those species, songbird, whatever it is, treated the same way. But in the context of how the service and the regulatory agencies look at them, they even break them out into different classifications. They talk about them differently. But the construct hasn't followed that in terms of the regulatory regime. And I think in the context of prioritization, you have to talk about triage. We do not have enough money. We do not have enough personnel. And if Trump gets his way, we will have less personnel to administer these laws. We can't save everything. We can't save every habitat. It is a reality. But MBTA is predicated on the notion that we will. Every one of those nests is sacrosanct under that law. Now it's up to the scientists and others to tell me that they need to be. And I would argue in the context of this symposium, I would like to know if they should be. But folks, triage is in our midst. We've got to have a different paradigm, and I would argue that even under Endangered Species Act, even under NEPA authorizations, even under FLTMA, because those are broad, sort of glorious, tonal laws that say we want to do good things for everybody. We can't. We've tried it since 1976 under the FLTMA mandates. We can't. We can try. I mean, ask the BLM about it. Ask the agencies who administer it. They can't do it. And then you hardwire on top of that absolute strict liability in these circles of quarter mile, half mile, mile. You get away from a multiple use mandate pretty quickly, and it's across a broad landscape. Just looking at the Converse County EIS and doing a quick look at the overlays of all of those species that are triggering Migratory Bird Treaty Act or could trigger Migratory Bird Treaty Act protection, you get to single use pretty quick. And yeah, we can do an avian protection plan, and yeah, we can talk about prosecutorial discretion, but it still doesn't matter at the end of the day. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's right. Now, I'm purposefully trying to bait you into a discussion later on. I also think we have to talk about mitigation in a real sense. Avian protection plans are planning in advance, and it's sort of mitigation. But it, again, really doesn't matter in the context of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. You can mitigate till the cows come home, you can still be prosecuted, and you will still lose. Mitigation in nearly any other context is, if you do it as a condition of your permit, we will write that in, and we will say, this is great, go forth and do good things. You can't do that with MBTA. And the problem is all those other laws that I talked about earlier, SMACRA, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, it's carried forward in each of those decision points. It's bootstrapped back through those laws that we've enacted through time as a mandate. And properly so under the existing laws of the land today. The question is, should it? Should it? For the 900 species or so that are on that list across this country, should we do that? That is a policy call, but it's informed by science. So this notion of scientists keeping your skirt clean and out of the ditch of that dirty policy discussion, that's not real, guys. When you draw a buffer, you are making a policy call. When you recommend a buffer, you are making a policy call. So you can't, there is no bright line. There's not a bright line. And I think mitigation needs to be informed by science. It needs to be informed by the realities of the place you exist. And that's how it's done in large part. But right now, it's kind of a false promise under MBTA. It is a false promise. So now let's talk about this decision-relevant science. And so this is another reason I like Gary Bouvet, is we met in the context of decision-relevant science. There was a mouse that we still have in the state that exists today. We tried to say it didn't for a long time, but the science, that damn science, said it did. And the Wyoming pocket gopher, we had a petition to list it, and I went to Gary and I said, Gary, I have a bucket of money. Tell me everything I need to know about the Wyoming pocket gopher. Should it be listed? What threat are we under? Build that model, Gary, and tell me and give me that decision space that says, when I go to talk to Governor Freudenthal, what's reality? What should we say about this petition? Are we protecting our flank? Are we boring full speed ahead and fighting? What are we doing? Where am I at? Narrowfoot Hygrotis diving beetle. We got Gary, a invertebrate biologist, for the first time in the history of the program over that species because we were scared of what it meant for CBM. The Absaroka front, we were talking about it last night, Gregory. We sat down because there was a big dispute between the counties and the BLM and the Game and Fish and the governor's office at the time over how to protect the Absaroka front. We had grizzly bears, we had big game populations, and we sat down with this tool, GIS, that I still don't understand. I love it. I generally get it. I don't understand how it works. People in my office give me maps that say come from that data set. But in each of these instances, the science had the ability to shift the policy needle, to inform the policy needle, to inform the policy discussion. And I guess my challenge for you all, in the context of the many science discussions and the fascinating discussions that happened yesterday, the eagle discussion was fascinating to me. The science that is being brought to bear in terms of migration, in terms of wintering habitat, in terms of nests, in terms of where these birds are, it informs a great deal. But at the end of the day, if it can't get you off the hook for anything, if it can't lead to a different decision, if the buffer stays no matter what, why do the science? Yeah, it may inform the permit discussion in terms of whether or not the DEQ can grant the mine permit, or the BLM can grant the mine permit, and that has to be done as a precondition. But after the fact, why continue to survey if it's an absolute exclusion zone? There's no reason. But could it? And I guess that's my argument back to you all, is if you change the way we look at MBTA and the way it's enforced with the thoughtful regulatory take paradigm, and with a true offering of mitigation that matters, then I think you have every right, and the state has every interest, the commissioners have every interest in saying, let's pour money into this science. Let's decide what can shift the needle, what can move that buffer, what can expand that buffer in certain instances. But not now. Another word on decision-relevant science. We're teaching it at a very young age. My son just participated in the Laramie County Science Fair. He got a ribbon for his project that was dropping an egg from various heights off of a ladder with different kinds of bubble wrap on it. And it was a nice ribbon. He was very proud of himself, and he learned a lot about, gravity and how it affects eggs, and what kind of bubble wrap protects eggs the best. But other kids got binoculars, and they got fancy home meteorological stations from the BOPU, Board of Public Utilities in Cheyenne. Why? Because their projects had a direct bearing on the watershed that BOPU was dealing in. They had a direct impact on the work that was going into the local conservation district's work on soils. It was decision relevant. As much as I love my son and loved the zeal with his project, it was not decision relevant. The bubble wrap manufacturers were not going to come out of the woodwork to learn this science. It was fun. It was great, but it wasn't going to move the needle on anything. If you want to get the binoculars, if you want to engage with the folks that can give you the fancy home meteorological system, you have to be able to move that needle. So we're going through this very tortured, ugly process right now. I sit on the Wyoming Community Foundation board. And there's this idea that we can make a better strategic plan, which I think is garbage, because I think strategic planning is garbage. But at any rate, in the context of that, and context is my word today, we see this idea of the 9 whys come about. And the basic idea is, if for every idea we have, and for every goal, and for every high-minded ethic we think we possess, you have to ask 9 whys about it. So I say, I sit on the Wyoming Community Foundation board because I like to do good things for kids. Well, why? Well, because I have a kid and I want him to have a nice place to live. Well, why? Because I want him to be able to stay and live and work in the state, and I want to be able to see my grandkids. Well, why? And that's where my dad says, yeah, why do you want to see your grandkids after he's been dealing with my kids the last 2 days? But I think it's informative, and I don't know that you always need to go 9 levels deep. But I think whether it's policymakers, whether it's companies, whether it's the science community, you should, and we're taught this in sort of the first entry-level science courses that you go into in 3rd and 4th grade, and even younger today, is why is the best question. And if you get to the end of it and why can't be answered because there's a hardwired decision point that cannot be moved, so why go any further? And so I know this is disconcerting for some, but it's the reality we live in. We don't have endless pots of cash to throw at every issue. And at some point, people throw their hands in the air and they say, if I can't do anything about it, I'm not going to invest anything more in it. We're not going to do the best bells and whistles mitigation program if it really doesn't matter. We're going to do the bare necessity to mitigate our risk to the point that it'll mollify the BLM regulator and the Fish and Wildlife Service so we can get our permit, but the innovation stops there. At least that's been my experience. Maybe you have different experiences. That's okay. So these are the policy statements I would offer up, that I would suggest for you for your consideration. I think nest buffers and management of those nest buffers and populations should at least be consistent across all jurisdictions. One field office should not be different than another. If, as Gwen told me yesterday, the science is good and the literature is good, there should not be a different buffer in one field office than another. There should not. I believe that to be true. Raptors and other migratory birds should be formally segregated into those that require additional help. We're doing it informally. We don't do it formally. And those that should be left to the states for conservation or not. This goes back to the notion that we can't save everything everywhere. We can try our best. We're not going to get it done. My sense here is that if I polled this room and I listed 6 or 7 different populations of raptors, let's leave the songbirds and let's leave all that out. If I were to give you a list, just two, let's talk about ferruginous hawks and red-tailed hawks. Are they even in your eyes? Are the threats the same for them? I don't think so. I've heard the sidebar discussions, and they're not. We've got to treat it that way in a regulatory sense, and until we do, they're all the same. They all get treated the same. I think regulatory take should be built into the MBTA, but permits should only be required where the species require additional help. So there was the effort that Dave talked about yesterday during the last administration to build in a regulatory take provision, but it was for all the species. Every single one of them would have had a regulatory take requirement. Fish and Wildlife Service itself pushed back. So the reality is, and this is part of that prioritization sense and triage we have to do, we've got to realize what we really can move the needle on, what we really need to move the needle on. And the last thing is, if species are in real trouble, a species should be listed under the ESA. That did not exist at the time that the Act was created in 1918. It does today. And as I mentioned earlier, strangely enough, the ESA, which is this high bar platinum standard, it still allows regulatory take authorization. So I guess it boils down to my sense, just from my experience, that at some point we have to get to yes, and yes has to truly mean yes. If you're going to say no, just do it, analyze it, make that decision. But it shouldn't be because of some artificial congressional construct that doesn't make sense to me. And it doesn't achieve the conservation that we all think it is. It's just making people mad. It's just pushing business out of the state. It's not contributing to, I don't think, a true intellectual shift in this realm. If it did, we wouldn't be talking about the same buffers we did 20 years ago and carrying them forward into the next RMP or the next plan document. We haven't moved the needle on that stuff. It's the same. I mean, you can probably argue with me and tell me, no, I'm wrong, and no, things have changed. It really hadn't in terms of what you face on the ground. So, in that sense, I want to offer a closing word on discretion, and then I want to answer questions and do whatever you all want to do with the rest of our time. But, you know, the nice thing about discretion is we leave it to people, and if they're people we trust, discretion is a great thing. But if it's somebody that we don't trust or that we think is going to somehow twist the knife in our back after we walk out, it's not a good thing. And so for those of you who are doubtful that my theories are correct and my absolute policy statements are correct, I leave you with this idea of discretion. And think of it in terms of first of all, the discretion applied when you apply that buffer and make a decision as to whether or not you're going to move it. That's a risk management decision, and it's applied not really as a discretionary matter, but it's removed as a discretionary matter in very limited circumstances through avian protection plans and that. But the question is, who's applying that discretion at the end of the day? And is the guy that applied it yesterday going to be the same guy that's going to have to apply it at the end if there's an actual take of a species? Same thing with U.S. attorneys and the decision to prosecute. The discretion lies in that individual officer from the Office of Law Enforcement that comes out and says, you know, the last guy said if you did this, this would be good enough. But you know, you irritated the hell out of me last week, and now I've got a little different perspective on that, no matter what they said. People change, things change. Is that really a thoughtful regulatory program? Look, guys, this isn't tiddlywinks. This is the full power of the federal government of the United States that has the power to come down and say, and I'm not talking about BLM, I'm talking about the Department of Justice. I'm talking about criminal prosecution, individual prosecution. They have the power to destroy companies. In this age, if you get busted for killing a bunch of eagles, your project can be toast. Not only your project, but you can be toast. Your company can be toast. Are you going to leave that to discretion, or do you want to stand up a system that's real, that's predictable? I'd argue we do. I want that. I know my rights if I go out and break the law. They repeat them to me before I go to jail. As an attorney, I know the process. With this, I know the process as it was applied to me and given to me by the guy who said at the time it was okay, but that may change. That person may change. That person may leave. I don't think that's a way to set up a thoughtful regulatory program. And I don't think it's fair. So, not that my sense of fairness matters to you all, but now you know what I think. And I look forward to any questions that you might have.
I'm Nicole Rubeck with ICF. From my experiences, I found that the recommended buffers that the Fish and Wildlife Service has aren't absolute exclusion zones. We've been able to work alongside with Trish and the Fish and Wildlife Service and have activities occur in those buffers. It did take increased monitoring to do that, but we have had industries that have been able to do that, and we've actually in the past worked with an oil and gas company who was developing a monitoring plan very similar to the coal mines in order to be able to work year-round, and a lot of it was looking at just using increased monitoring to be able to figure out what nests are active and where they can work and where they can move the rigs. So I do think that if you are looking proactive and working with the Fish and Wildlife Service and doing that, then that these buffers aren't absolute. And I also you mentioned that all species are looked at the same, and in a way they are because they're all protected. But even with the buffers, you're looking at different size buffers. You have a 1 mile buffer for the Fruginous hawk because a lot of them nest on the ground, so they're a little bit more sensitive to disturbance, whereas you have a red tail that's got a quarter mile buffer, or the great horned owl that's got a 0.125 mile buffer. So there is a little bit of difference in those two based on the species and their sensitivity to disturbance.
No, and I absolutely agree with you. I agree with both points. I think we have instances in this room where discretion is applied, you can get a permit, and you can move forward. But the reality always exists at the end of the day, under a strict liability regime without a formal take authorization, that no matter what they do, the U.S. Attorney's Office can still come in and prosecute. And I don't think that's fair. I think if you've done all of that, and we've all agreed that we've done all of that, and we've done it well, there shouldn't be that back-end hammer that sits out there in the event that some bird flies through the louvers of the local compressor station and gets killed. But that's reality. And I agree with you. I mean, there are very well-intentioned people in this room that I've worked with, that I've talked to, that I know have applied that discretion. A lot of the scientists in this room have jobs in order to build those plans, and I agree. I just think it should be a more formalized process with clear metrics and a clear delineation of the rules. Because right now, it's based upon the discretion of the prosecutor, the discretion of the local law enforcement officer, and up front, the discretion of the authorizing officer. And I don't think under FLTMA and the organic statutes of those agencies they can get rid of that. And I wouldn't offer that. I just think if it's an even playing field and there isn't this hook on the back end sitting out there that says, well, you better do this because you're going to get hammered. It's a more fair negotiation and a more fair depiction of what really needs to be done. And I think it opens up innovation too. To your notion that the buffers, I agree. The buffers are different. I mean, you read any land use plan, it says it's quarter mile for this one, half mile for that one, a mile for that one. Absolutely. And discretion's applied, but I think there could be more innovation. I don't know what it is, but I have to think we've advanced a little bit more than that in 40 years.
Where you're talking about more of the project-based monitoring, because then you can look at the pair instead of just, well, every Frugianus hawk is 1 mile. Well, maybe this pair isn't as sensitive as that pair over there. And so that's where the on-site actual monitoring becomes very important, because then you can say, well, this pair is used to haul trucks running by it every 5 minutes, and this pair is used to rancher coming by like once a day. So that's kind of where you go from a landscape level to a site-specific level.
And I agree. I think that's great. But I also think it's hollow at the end of the day if they can come back and still get hit.
Morning, Ryan. Jim Willix, Commissioner, Converse County. 2 questions. One on your discretion. When we're looking at plans, and maybe it's because of the Raptor we're specific to that, but when we have to take years to develop a plan that's supposed to be in place for plan, Converse County EIS being an example, what's your view on building discretion and flexibility, and maybe you view those as different, in that plan so that you can adapt to changing conditions in that time frame that you may be dealing with, 10 to 15 years? Because I tend to think flexibility is good, but maybe discretion is bad. So maybe differentiate there if there is one there.
There isn't, Jim. I mean,
yeah, okay.
I mean, my ability to get a permit is, that's flexibility, and I want that. But I want the authorizing officer to exercise absolute discretion to grant me that leeway. My deal is this. So this idea of adaptive management, I think, is fairly well established now as the way you should do it. You should measure and you should look at, just like we were talking, you should look at it based on a site-specific basis. You should look at it in a holistic sense across the planning area, across the project area, against that individual action area. And you should learn from it. We should apply what we learn, and we should make it better through time. We should do better. And I think that's perfectly acceptable. The issue is, and it always has been with adaptive management, is you have to commit to the monitoring. You have to commit to actually setting up a regimented process and a defined process to adapt through time. And then you, frankly, this is where the industry has to be flexible on the back end, is if things are going down the toilet, you have to be willing to say, up to the point of saying, I'm going to stop my activity, if that's what that plan calls for. So I like adaptive management, but it's got a lot of hooks and barbs in it, and I think appropriately so, if you're going to apply it correctly. But you're right. Over a 20-year lifespan of a plan, that's why there's a lot of discretion built into that planning discussion and document. But If you're going to do it right, do it consistent with the best practices of what truly adaptive management is, I think.
Thanks, Ryan. And then the second part goes back to you, both you and Governor Freudenthal talked about the 10th Circuit and how it views things different in the strict liability. So what's the remedy to that? Is it a case in our favor? Is it law change? How do we move either their interpretation, or do we have to go clear back to Congress and reopen that? And I think Governor Freudenthal said be careful what you wish for. So how do we move the needle at the 10th Circuit in that issue, if possible?
Well, so two ways. One, you get the 10th Circuit to change precedent, which isn't likely given the principle of stare decisis. If you're going to follow the previous precedent, that's what we do. We're worse than scientists in that way, because by God, in 1943, they said this is the way it should be, and we're going to do it that way today. So you either have to change that, which isn't likely. You have to have a conflict in the circuits that goes up to the Supreme Court. So our circuit is different than one in North Dakota. The Supreme Court says, well, you know, we want to resolve this, and we're going to decide which one we're going to choose as a nationwide matter, because this is a law of nationwide applicability. That hasn't happened. The third way to do it is to go to Congress and say, we're going to build in a regulatory take provision. We're going to build in the sort of authorizations for mitigation and that can get your head out of the noose at the back end of the process. Those are the only options that I know of.
So triage those three. Which one do you target first?
Congress, which is a scary proposition. Any other questions?
Just at the end of the day, just like Ryan said, is you're an operator, it's very hard to undertake a $10 million project with the unknown that you can plan and you can make very thoughtful decisions with the data, which I appreciate the data discussions because it helps us to make good decisions on making the least amount of impact to the wildlife and all the other, I mean, there's probably, I would say, 30 different impacts that we look at, not just wildlife. But at the end of the day, if you still don't have an assurance that you're gonna accept some risk and the agency's gonna allow that, it's extremely hard to make a good decision on a very long-term, highly expensive project. So I mean, I would agree, it's just challenging. We aren't out to do any harm to our wildlife, our resources, but again, we need to try to make a thoughtful decision, and when we can work with some more assurances, it really is. It's just much beneficial to everybody involved.
Questions? If not, thank you for tolerating another policy discussion. I appreciate it.